Hi, I'm Max Rodriguez, and this is Writers on Writing. Our guest today is Valerie Graves, a recognized expert in all facets of advertising. Recognized by Advertising Age as one of the 100 best and brightest, and author of Pressure Makes Diamonds, Becoming the Woman I Pretended to Be. So Valerie,
Yes.
welcome to Writers on Writing. We're so happy that you joined us today to talk about your new book, Pressure Makes Diamonds. So what prompted you to write the book? What prompted you, after an illustrious career in advertising, to write a book about your life, your childhood, how you came to hold the positions that you have? And we'll talk more about those positions.
Okay. Well, I found myself without a job. The New York office of the agency that I was working for was closed down, and I had a year in which I could not work. Thankfully, I was paid for that year, but I had the time to do it. I had a friend who's a writer who encouraged me very much to write this book, a man named Zev Shafetz, who's a hometown friend of mine. And I thought, yeah, because there are experiences that are kind of unique to being a Black woman in advertising, and I thought they were worth writing about.
So you were, in fact, a Black woman in advertising ever since. You were a copywriter, a creative director, and then a chief creative officer.
Yes, that's right.
Tell us about that trajectory.
In advertising, on the creative side, there are basically the visual disciplines, which are the art director type people, and then the writers, who are people like me, who were always those kids who were making up stories and giving little shows in the backyard and that kind of thing. That was me. So I was pretty much born a copywriter. And found my way into advertising by an interesting and circuitous path, as you'll see if you read
what was that? Well, let's tell us.
Well,
and we'll read your book anyway.
Okay, good. Well, as I say, I was always that creative little kid, always doing something, always making up something, always putting on a show. And so when I came out of college, and that's a long story too, that's in the book. I was in Detroit. I was a young parent. I had a small child, and of course I was totally dependent upon my support system of people who cared for my child and were helping me raise him. So I was looking for something creative to do, and in Detroit there was big time advertising because of the automotive industry. And I thought, well, that's what I'll do. And I foolishly never doubted that I could do anything creative that I wanted to do. I was always kind of stuck out in the neighborhood that I came from, in the environment that I came from, for being this little creative kid. So it didn't occur to me, I wasn't smart enough to question whether or not I could do something like advertising. So I just thought, well, that's what I'll do.
So your life then mirrors the lives of many young African-American women who are growing up, finding themselves in this world and having great imagination.
Absolutely.
And what would you say to them today?
I would say that imagination, dreaming, the subtitle of my book is Becoming the Woman I Pretended to Be. And that's not pretending as in fake it till you make it. It's pretending as in holding that picture of yourself that you have created, that you are constantly creating and amending and kind of growing into it, which is something that happens naturally if you do that. So what I would say to them is keep dreaming. Keep pretending, keep kind of imagining who it is that you might be, and make sure that that's someone that you admire and are going to enjoy being when you get there.
Because you had no idea when you were a child that you would one day be a chief creative officer in an advertising agency.
No, I had no idea that existed. When I was growing up in Pontiac, Michigan, we used to go to Detroit for various things all the time. It was the city. It was 25 miles away. And the most direct way there was down Woodward Avenue, like straight from Pontiac to Detroit. And on the way, we would always pass this beautiful, impressive building on the side of the road. And I would think, I don't know what they do in that building, but whatever it is, it's probably something really cool, and that's probably what I want to do. And all those many years later, I found myself working in that building in my first job in advertising at Darcy McManus and Mages Advertising.
And what are some of the other companies that you've worked in? Just to give us a context within which we can see where you started and where you ended.
Okay. Well, as I said, I started out in big league mainstream advertising, working on cars, working on the Pontiac brand. After about 2 weeks in advertising, I got drafted into the Pontiac brand at Darcy by a sort of visionary creative director who thought, what if we ask a girl what she thought about a car? So my partner, who was also a young woman, and I were drafted into the Pontiac group. We were the two women with a group of about 20 men. So that's how I started my career. I went from there to another car account in Detroit at BBDO, which is still one of the leading agencies worldwide. And from there to Boston, to Kenyon and Eckhart, which got folded in all these many mergers. It doesn't exist anymore, but at the time was a major mainstream advertising agency. From there, back to Detroit, to Ross Roy, which was a big Michigan advertising agency. And from there, my career went, oh, I'm sorry, did I say J. Walter Thompson?
No.
Because I did go from Ross Roy to J. Walter Thompson in New York. That was my first New York job. And after Ross Roy, I took across the road when Byron Lewis of Uniworld Group offered me just what sounded like and turned out to be a dream job working in advertising targeted to African Americans for some of the biggest brands in the world. So I moved permanently to, my husband and I moved permanently to New York, and I took that job, which just turned out to be one of the best jobs that I ever had in my life.
And what was your experience being a black woman in a male-dominated industry?
You could call the first part of my career my life as a white guy, because I was working, as I said, with my partner, who happened to be a Japanese woman, in a group that, other than us, consisted entirely of white men. And my success, my early success, was really predicated on how much I could sort of be like them, develop the same sensibilities, sense of humor. I pretty much did not have the opportunity to bring anything about myself as a black woman, as a black person, into my work until I went on into the multicultural side of things. It was all just dependent on, how good an impression of a white man can you do, and I was pretty good at it.
That's very interesting. In reading your book, I know that in the earlier part of your life, you were a rocker.
Oh yeah.
Tell us a little about how do you sort of balance the music against the culture?
The music and the culture at that time were one. It was a culture of, sort of drug, sex, and rock and roll was the rallying cry of the day. I was, 19, 20 years old. It was very exciting to me. I had an opportunity as a writer before I got into advertising to write about music, and that sort of did it. I think in the book I talk about the fact that the first time I heard Gimme Shelter, it was all over for me.
Rolling Stones?
The Rolling Stones, absolutely. And that piece of music in particular, because it was so complex, musically and exciting and just thrilling to me, and sort of represented the whole zeitgeist of the times that I grew up in.
And then you began working with Uniworld.
I did. That's a funny story, too. I was supposed to work for Uniworld. I knew, even though they didn't know it, that I was only going to be there for a year because my husband was getting a master's degree at Columbia, and we were moving to New York just for 1 year, and then going back to Michigan until my son got out of high school. So we were all set. I was going to go work at Uniworld. He was going to go to Columbia. Everything was wonderful. We got married, spent all our money on a wedding, and about a week later, I got a letter from Uniworld saying that they would not be able to offer me this job anymore. So we were sort of broke and trying to decide what we were going to do. Should I stay in Detroit and let my husband go to New York? No.
Smart choice.
I couldn't even bear the thought of it. So I worked out a plan to do some freelance work, long distance in Detroit, and we went off to New York anyway. And during that first year, when I actually ended up working at J. Walter Thompson, Byron Lewis approached me again and gave me a fabulous freelance assignment to do some work for AT&T, which I think was probably still Bell Telephone then. But it was doing a print campaign about just some of the giants of the arts in the African American, well, in the world, period. James Van Der Zee was featured in our ad, great photographer. Right. Arthur Mitchell, the founder of the Dance Theater of Harlem, Marva Collins from West Side Prep in Chicago, and Elma Lewis, who founded a group in Boston that she had kids doing Shakespeare in the Park, and she said those kids barely knew what language they were speaking, but she had these black kids doing this stuff in the park. That work, which was a great freelance assignment, really cemented the idea in my mind that this was work that I enjoyed. But I still went back to the general market for 3 years. You didn't walk away from general market advertising to multicultural advertising without thinking about it long and hard, because basically you got written off if you did that by the general market world. And that happened to me too. Just as I arrived at Uniworld, I was named by Advertising Age magazine one of the 100 best and brightest in the industry. That recognition really came from the Ross Roy agency nominating me. Well, after I joined Uniworld, I was never recruited by a general market agency again. So I went from being one of the 100 best and brightest to apparently just persona non grata because I had crossed over to the dark side, literally.
Well, that brings up a good question about advertising. Here's an idea about advertising. In looking at some advertising, I see that we see many mixed couples now. But the male in that mixed couple relationship is inevitably white.
Inevitably?
Apparently.
There's a pretty famous Cheerios commercial that has run recently in which the husband is black and the child is clearly biracial and the wife is white. I hadn't noticed that so much, that the husband is always white. But of course, I noticed the phenomenon that you're talking about. That's a response to the demographics of America, to the big changes in America, the browning of America. It's one response. What is happening is that what's called general market advertising, which used to just be a euphemism for advertising to white people, there was really very little thought given to anyone else. Even when I was working there, my life as a white guy, remember, there was very little thought given to people of color and what our needs or wishes might be. It was just sort of, well, you know, fall in line. Now that the country is shifting to be much more a country of color, the money, of course, is going with it. And what's happening is that general agencies are, largely through casting, being much more inclusive than they ever were early in my career. If you look at commercials now, you will often see a mix of people. It's even given rise to something called the racially ambiguous person. And therein lies I don't have a problem with that approach because it's what general advertising always should have been. It speaks to everyone generally. But I still do think that there is a place, and it's being lost, for advertising that is targeted to different groups because their history is different. We as African Americans have developed a whole set of behaviors in response to our history in this country, what kinds of brands we use. I'm sure it won't surprise you if I say, Black people drink fine liquors. We tend to like beautiful automobiles. These are things that Byron Lewis used to call portable status symbols. We use them to make ourselves feel better about our standing in this country. And we might not, for example, be able to live wherever we wanted to live or afford the kind of houses that we wanted, but we could almost always afford to buy the best liquor, drive a nice car, wear really nice clothes. Those things are, in some cases, different for us. Our behavior as consumers is very much related to who we are in this country and our image of ourselves. And there should be a place for that in advertising too, along with general advertising that is in reality general, which in the past it wasn't.
Tell us more about your book. What's your favorite part of your book?
I have so many favorite parts of that book, but the parts that I really love are the ones that speak to the authenticity of my existence as a Black woman in America. Someone asked me why I wrote the book, and in thinking about it, I thought this book is the answer to that client who said to me, come on now, you're not really Black. You're a big-time advertising executive, you live in New York, you're not really Black. But I'm just about as Black as they come, having experienced almost everything that is not cool about being a Black person, near poverty. We were not really poor, and living in Pontiac, Michigan, in an auto factory town that was booming. I didn't even realize that until I got to a place like New York and saw, really, really poor Black people and looked at what a project was in New York as compared to the garden apartment that I grew up in that was called a project in Michigan. But that, becoming a teenage parent, that story is in the book. Not finishing college because the struggle of being a college student full-time with a full-time job and having a small child just frankly got the better of me. There are people who can deal with that, but after 3 years of it, I just couldn't do it anymore. All of these things that people think of, being somewhat undereducated, not having a lot of money, having violence and having incarceration be part of one's world. People think of those things as the factors that make you not successful as an African American person. But they made me who I am. And so those are some of my favorite parts of the book. Some of my unexpected friends, my friend Laverne, who greatly impacted my life. She was a practical nurse, very rough around the edges, who became an improbable friend of mine and very much reminded me not to distance myself from a lot of the people and the culture that was all around me when I was growing up.
The title of your book, Pressure Makes Diamonds. Mm-hmm. What is the pressure?
All of the pressures that I just named to begin with, not ever seeming to have quite enough money, being discriminated against me when I was a child, it was just very open. Discrimination, not having as many resources in our schools as at the white school across town. In fact, when we went to high school, we suddenly were in an integrated situation and realized the difference between the education that we had gotten and they had gotten. But we did have the bonus of not being discriminated against at that school. So we learned to be leaders. We learned to do all of whatever there was to do we were the ones who were going to do it. And we had those opportunities. But the pressures of pretty much open discrimination at that time, the pressures of being a person of color in the advertising industry, the pressure to either conform or rebel, and I did both. I mean, the prologue to my book deals with the fact that at a big fancy company dinner, when asked to describe my job, and everyone was doing this in very humorous terms, and I thought, oh, what am I going to say that's funny? I described myself as copywriter and token. And no one knew quite what to do, so they all just sort of laughed. But 2 weeks later, I didn't have a job anymore. But there are those kinds of pressures, and then the normal pressures that anyone in the business of advertising has to put up with. There's the pressure to have an idea, to come up with a concept that is just common to all of us. There's the pressure of the power relationship. The client has the power in an advertising relationship, so there's always that. You could have the best idea in the world, and they could just kill it.
You mentioned one can conform or rebel. Mm-hmm. I would offer that you created the third. You can conform, you can rebel, or you can lead.
Yeah.
And that's what you did, and that's what comes through clearly in your book.
Well, thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I don't know that I ever set out to take a leadership role in advertising until perhaps very late in my career. But I guess if those are the choices, two of them were more attractive than the others.
Very good. Thank you so much, Valerie, for joining us on Writers on Writing.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Is there anything that you'd like to impart before we close out?
I'd like to bring it full circle to where we started, to say to every young person like myself who has some idea that they want to be something, do something, they don't see it around them, they don't know anyone else who's doing it, it doesn't matter. Keep dreaming, dream big, pretend to be it, and you will become it.
Thank you so much, Valerie.
Sure, thank you.
The book, Pressure Makes Diamonds: Becoming the Woman I Pretended to Be, a memoir by Valerie Graves. We hope you enjoyed Writers on Writing. Please visit us on our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and on QBR.com.